Hello, Narnach here. This is a video where I'm gonna go into a little bit more details on the trade-off between frenzy charges and power charges that I spoke of in my last video when I was running through the early parts of Act 2 Merciless. Because of course in Act 2 Merciless you make the choice between which bandits you are gonna side with, and most importantly of course which of the charges that you wanna grab a +1 for. For me, I'm playing a Deadeye focusing on Ice Shot. I wanna crit everything, mostly bosses. So the trade-off is gonna be, do I want a power charge or do I want a frenzy charge? As a ranger, it's easy to get frenzy charges, so there's an easy +3 frenzy charges within reach on the skill tree. Getting power charge is a little bit more difficult. The only power charge that you really have access to is the one over here in the shadow area. But there's 4 travel nodes to obtain it, whereas each of the frenzy charges for my particular skill tree, it's only two nodes to actually travel to. So it's efficient to pick up frenzy charges, it's a bit more cumbersome to pick up power charges. So with the default 3 power charges that we have, if we're going to choose Alira as our bandit in Merciless, that gets us to +4. Potentially if we pick up the Shadow Frenzy charge, that gets us to 5. In terms of power, in terms of frenzy charges, 3 by default. We want to grab the other 3 in the ranger area, that gets us to 6. If we don't side with Alira, but if we side with Kraken in Act 2 Merciless, that gets us to 7 charges and keeps us at 3 power charges. So that's a little bit of the context of what we wanna achieve. Currently, we're level 68, early Act 2 Merciless. And we have to make a choice. The way I talked about it, if we choose frenzy charges, it's going to increase our attack speed, it's going to increase the damage per shot. So, we're not going to increase our critical strike chance, but our base attack damage is going to be higher. So the crits we already do, because their base is going to be improved, the crits will actually hit harder, but we will not be critting as much as when we focus on power charges, which actually increase our chance to crit. Trade-off, of course, if you focus on crit chance, then yes, you crit more often. Those crits hurt more than normal attacks. But on average, you're not going to attack faster and you're not going to boost your damage. So it's not like you're going to take your crits to the next level in terms of damage output. You're just going to get more crits more often. And there is a trade-off there, because if you crit more often or if you attack more often, at some point there's going to be a balance between the two, where the average number of critical strikes that you perform per second, there's going to be a balance there. So what I did, made a spreadsheet, and I was just comparing at different stages in the build, based on just how we would allocate our skill point, or whether we would choose Alira or Kraken as our bandit of choice, what the impact would be on the build in terms of critical strikes per second, in terms of DPS, and in terms of the average damage that we do with a hit. Because for a build that wants to freeze bosses, you don't necessarily want a high DPS, you want a high damage per shot. Because it's every individual shot that determines whether it freezes a boss or not. It doesn't really matter if you hit a boss 10 times per second. If they're pinpricks, they're not going to freeze the boss ever. But if you hit the boss once per second and you hit him hard, you're going to freeze him and the boss is not really going to do much to you. So there's a couple of factors that we want to weigh, and a spreadsheet seemed like a useful way to determine that. So I've taken a couple of stages in the development of the build. The base that I'm going to work from is the current level 68 state that we are in. So we're using Death's Opus, which has a 150% increased critical strike multiplier. No, correction, we're not using Death's Opus, that's the one I want to use. We're using Death's Harp. So that's the base version. It's a unique bow that gives you +1 arrow, and it has a 150% increased critical strike multiplier. So our crits hurt a lot, compared to normally when you only have 50% critical strike multiplier to work with. This effectively turns that 50% into 200%. we get 1 extra arrow, and if we ever get the Death's Opus, we get an extra arrow, we get more flat damage. It's all going to be nice and lovely. So the next stage that we're going to look at is what happens if we reach maps. So there's a couple more skills that I want to grab. I want to at least grab 1 Frenzy Charge. Further over here in the range area is nice because you also get some increased evasion rating for every Frenzy Charge that you have. And I'd like to go for Acrobatics, Phase Acrobatics, just to get my dodge up a little bit. To just, not die when hit too often in a row. But for the rest, all the upgrades are going to be mostly defensive. So from here on out, we can compare. Okay, so what if we start running maps? We accumulate 4 skill points. I think it's useful, put them into Frenzy Charges first. So, somewhere along running white maps, we're gonna hit the maximum number of Frenzy Charges at 6. At that point, would it be more useful to have chosen Alira to get 4 power charges? Or would it have been more useful to have chosen Kraton to get ourselves to 7 Frenzy Charges? So there's going to be a trade-off that we can make there. Also going to look at, okay, power charges, they're maybe a little bit cumbersome to generate. Are they really worth it? Spoiler, yes, they are worth it, even though they are cumbersome. Later on, looking forward to the endgame state of the build. There's a lot of really, really nice nodes in the ranger area. Now you got things like Heartseeker over here, which gives you more crit strike, crit multiplier. Over here you got Assassination. And there's just all kinds of interesting nodes scattered throughout the tree that I've just avoided while leveling up, only going for the really, really juicy things. And once you start running maps, you pick up all the ones that you just couldn't pick up while leveling. So the net effect of that is that our damage goes up, our crit chance goes up, everything that we care about goes up. So all of the numbers that I'm going to show you in the spreadsheet, they are based on the current gear setup at level 68. So that's the weapon, that's the armor, but it's also the gems. So I haven't increased the gem levels or anything for the calculations, so the real numbers are of course going to be higher, going to find better gear, yada yada yada. No, that just as an aside in case someone starts to complain like, your damage numbers look low. That's not the point. It's all about comparing the effectiveness of the frenzy charges versus power charges in context of this build at different stages. So that's just as a small disclaimer aside. So level 68. The base build as we have it now, if we're shooting at regular mobs, we have a 47% chance to crit, but of course every crit needs to be confirmed. We currently have a 90% chance hit chance, so our effective crit rate is going to be 43%, because you need to roll your hit chance again to confirm a crit. We attack 2.15 times per second, and we have a DPS that's just over 15,000. Our attacks are 99% cold. There's a little bit of elemental damage in here from just added by rings and such, but it's mostly cold, so we're just going to focus on that. A normal hit is going to be between 2,000 and 4,600 damage. Our critical strike multiplier is 411 damage compared to a normal hit. A lot of that comes from a crit multiplier, but also some of that comes from Assassin's Mark, which is a curse we use, which increases the crit chance and it increases the critical strike damage taken by the monsters. Of course, normal mobs don't have curse resistance, so Assassin's Mark blasts in full effect and it increases our crit chance to pretty decent levels. So the net result is that if we crit, it's going to be between 8.4 and 18.9 thousand damage. It's quite a bit. If we do a little bit of math, we can do some calculations. How often do we crit per second? We know our attack speed, we know our hit chance, so we know how often we don't even hit, and we know our effective crit chance. If we multiply all of those, then we realize that we have 0.85 critical strikes per second. So that's okay, but of course that can be better. If we do similar math, then comparing DPS with hit chance and with the attacks per second, we come down that to the average hit no normal hits, crits, everything just averaged out, is going to be just shy of 8,000 damage per hit. If we're going to look at bosses, the numbers get a little lower. Well, actually they get quite lower. Bosses have 30% elemental resistance in maps, so our cold damage is just going to get shown off by 30%. Yes, we do have quite a bit of elemental damage penetration, but effectively we lose a 30% damage multiplier. That's quite a bit. On top of that, bosses are resistant to curses, 60% curse resistance, so the copper damage penetration from Frostbite is going to be less effective, but also Assassin's Mark is going to be less effective. So our crit chance goes down, and our critical damage multiplier given by Assassin's Mark also goes down. So the net result is that against bosses we have a listed crit chance of 41%. Effectively it's only 37%, so that's roughly 1 in 3 attacks that actually going to crit. Hit chance, attack speed, everything's going to be unaffected. But at DPS it drops down to 9.7 thousand damage per second. Cold damage 1400 to 3200 damage, and the crit multiplier is going to be lower, only 380%. So crits are going to hit between 5.5 and 12.500 damage. The crits, they will still be enough to actually crit low tier map bosses. The tier 1 map boss will be frozen, I think, from a crit of around 4,500 points of damage. I made another spreadsheet actually where I looked that up. But these numbers, there should still be enough to roughly reliably freeze white maps. Bosses in white maps that don't have more life and don't mess with any resistances or with curses, you should be able to crit them pretty reliably. The problem is, against these bosses, we're only critting as 0.74 times per second. So now that's once every 1.3 seconds you perform a critical strike. Now, if you roll a base tier crit, that's going to be freeze the boss for 300 milliseconds. Yeah, they're going to be not frozen for a second, then frozen for 300 milliseconds. Then they're going to be not frozen for a second, and then again frozen for 300 milliseconds. So it's roughly about a quarter of the time they'll actually be frozen. The rest of the time they'll be haunting you. So not entirely what you want. If you roll a top end crit, 1200 damage, that's going to be closer to 0.6, 0.7 seconds. So it's going to be half-half. It's a good start, but it's not ideal yet. But of course, keep in mind, we're not using any charges here. So what if we add charges to the mix? Then it gets interesting. Frenzy charges, 3 base, power charges, 3 base, crit chance goes up to 54%, effectively 50. Attacks per second goes slightly up, 2.3 per second. And our DPS goes up to just shy of 14,000. All the numbers go up. In the end, our crits are going to be between 6 and 14,000 damage. So that's still way more than enough to crit a white map boss. But our effective number of crits per second goes up to 1.06 per second. So we're actually critting more than once per second now. That is good. That is pretty darn good. The effective damage per hit also goes up, 6,500 damage. So, if we're gonna crit, then we're gonna crit the boss for a bit longer. I think with a top end crit, you can actually freeze a boss for maybe just a second. So if you manage to get lucky and you string a couple of top end critical strikes about once per second, you might actually nearly freeze lock a boss, which is awesome. Okay, this is just the base tier. With a level 68 character that's in Act 2 against map bosses. That's not entirely fair because we have still some leveling to do. So let's actually pick a bandit. The choice between Kraken and Alira. And we're going to pick up at least 1 frenzy charge from the skill tree. So we're level 73, we're going to run maps. What happens next? Let's say we pick Alira, because it's going to be the best one in terms of crits. We have an effective crit rate of 63%, 2.36 attacks per second. And DPS is going to be just shy of 18,000. That's pretty good considering the gear we're using is all from Cruel. This is pretty nice DPS in my not so humble opinion. The damage per hit, it's going to be okay, but if we crit between 7 and 15,500 damage, and we crit 1.37 times per second, averaging 8,200 damage per second per hit. Now, the freeze times on bosses are just getting longer and longer and longer. If instead of Alira we choose Kraton, we get an extra frenzy charge, we lose a power charge, so our attack speed goes up, 2.42 attacks per second, our damage per hit goes up, but if you compare the numbers, 1802 for Alira, 1856 for Kraton, we get 54 damage at the low end. At the top end, there's going to be about 150 damage that we add. Small difference, but it's not like, wow, this is a world-changing thing, not a game-changing thing. For the crits, of course, it goes almost times 4, so no, there the difference is slightly larger. If you crit with the extra frenzy charge, you're going to get about 540 extra points of damage in the top end, and about 200 points of damage at the low end. So yeah, that's a small amount of extra freeze time. But the thing is, you're freezing less often. It's going to be 1.31 crits per second versus 1.37 crits. So DPS is higher, damage per hit is the DPS is higher with Frenzy, damage per hit and the number of crits per second is higher with Alira. If no, this is all too complicated and you think like, no, ignore those power charges, I'm just going to go with Kraton, I'm not going to use power charges, screw it. Then your DPS goes down from 18,000 to just under 16,000. So you're losing 2,400 DPS just from not using the power charges. Your crit chance goes down from nearly 60% to 45%. Crit per second goes down from 1.31 to 1 crit per second. And your damage per hit also goes down from 8,100 to 7,100 in damage. So you're losing 1,000 damage per hit from those 3 measly power charges. So conclusion here, power charges, they are useful. And now as the numbers scale up, the importance of power charges only becomes better. So let's look at what if we add another 2 power charges to the mix. Then if we choose Kraton, we have 7 frenzy charges. I think I said power charge to the mix. Of course, I meant what if we're running maps and we pick up all the frenzy charges in the rangers area, in the shadow area, and in the ranger area, duelist area, and we also choose Kraton. That's going to get us 7 frenzy charges, 2.52 attacks per second, 20,250 DPS, and 1.37 crits per second with a damage per hit of 8,700. Now, if you're going to crit, and you're going to crit 59% of the times, you are going to crit between 7,500 and 17,000 damage. With Cruel tier gear, running against map bosses, I think even in low tier yellow maps, you will still be freezing bosses with this. Might not always be freezing them, you might not be freezing them for a long time, but you will still be freezing bosses occasionally. And on white maps, poor bosses, because they'll effectively be freeze locked if you get a lucky streak. And given how much damage you're doing, well, they might not live too long. So frenzy charges are nice. If we pick Alira, we lose a frenzy charge, gain a power charge, then our crit chance goes up by 4%. So 59% becomes 63%. Attack speed goes down a little bit, and our DPS goes down by 200 points. So 20,000, we lose 200%. So this is less than 1% damage that you lose by choosing power charges over frenzy charges. So if you're doing it all from DPS, this is a rounding error. It doesn't matter which charge you choose. Simply the effect on DPS is negligible. The damage per crit is actually lower with Alira, because of course frenzy charges, they increase your base damage, and of course the critical strike multiplier is not affected by power charges. So your crits are going to be less powerful if you weigh the balance in favor of the power charges. But because you're critting more often, on average your damage per hit is going to go up. So 1.43 crits per second instead of 1.37. And your average damage per hit is going to be 8800 rather than 8700. So that is the trade-off that we already saw at the lower level, and which, well, we already thought out reasonably. Power charges, you do more damage per hit. Frenzy charges, your average damage goes up. And for a level 91 version of this build, still using Cruel Tier gear, if you focus completely on the frenzy charges, 3500 DPS, or 35,000 DPS even, versus with Alira, hey what, it's also 35,000. It's just a small gap of just under 4,000 points of damage, which again, it's less than 1% difference. So it still doesn't matter even in the top end. The crit chance here is 68% versus 72%, so that's almost 10% more than we were comparing at the low tier maps. And by this time, well, with level 91, you will probably be running red maps. So again, for the damage per second, it doesn't matter. If you look at crits per second, 1.58 versus 1.64, well, it's a small difference there. And the damage per hit is still in favor of Alira instead of Kraken. And you could, of course, make the trade-off. It's 2 points to pick up a frenzy charge, it's 4 points to pick up the power charge. So what if you give up the points and you don't pick up the frenzy charges, instead you go for the power charge? Because, well, we just reasoned out, if you're going to go for Alira, then, well, your damage is going to be better, right? Well, turns out that's only relevant if you're not actually paying skill points for the power charge. Because if you go down to 4 frenzy charges and up to 5 power charges, then our effective crit rate is 76%. So that's up from the previous Alira. But our attack speed goes down. Our DPS goes down by quite a bit actually. It's 33,000 versus 35,000. So those two frenzy charges actually make quite some impact. And if we then look all the way down here, yes, we are performing more crits per second, 1.66. But the damage per hit is just a little lower than with Alira. And that's because you just have less frenzy charges to support them. So the conclusion is that the opportunity cost for picking up the shadow power charge is too high, and instead it's better to pick up the 2 frenzy charges from the skill tree. But when it comes to picking bandits, pick Alira over Kraken, and you will be freezing things more often, more reliably, and that's gonna be it. And in terms of DPS, only if you really want to squeeze out the last less than a 1% of DPS, in that case, go Kraken. Otherwise, if no rounding errors, if it's all the same, then pick Alira and you will be happy. And with that, I'm gonna thank you very much for watching. Of course, next episode I will be choosing Alira as my bandit, picking up that power charge, and then we're gonna move forward and hopefully get to maps soon. And actually get maybe a 5-link or something, so we can actually start generating those power charges. Because I've been talking about power charges and how great they are, but they are still a pain to generate reliably. You currently using Frenzy with power charge on crit. That's probably the most reliable way to generate them without having to kill something. Because of course, if you're fighting a boss and there's no add-ons, you're not killing something, and most of the ways to generate power charges rely on you killing something. And well, if you want to use the power charges against bosses, you actually should have a reliable way of generating them. But power charge from crit with low crit rates, it also has a low chance of actually generating those power charges on crit. So it all conspires to just keep your power charges at 0. As you can see, the crit chances go up. Well, if you're at 0 power charges at the end game, you're still running 56% chance to crit. So you're going to be critting just over 1.3 times per second, which is quite a contrast with currently where we're only critting 0.74 times per second. The power charge on crit is also going to level, so the chance of actually generating a power charge whenever we crit also goes up. So in the end, you will be more reliably generating power charges, and it's going to be worth it. So I'm hoping that we will reach that tipping point soon enough. But, well, that's going to be a concern for the Let's Play. So for now, I'm going to thank you very much for watching. And I'll see you again next time. Bye bye.